Worship leaders, worship musicians, and those who love to worship. What is the proper balance between ministry and family? What should that look like? Well, today I want to give my response to something I heard Cory Asbury talk about. And Cory Asbury is the guy who wrote Reckless Love. It was the worship song of the year in 2018. But he talked about his experience at the now defunct International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And I wanted to share my thoughts about that. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Worship Homestead. My name is Nathan Smith. Thank you for joining me. Today, I wanted to share my thoughts about something I heard Cory Asbury say on an interview that he did on Rita Springer's podcast. But before we get there, I want to give you something. If you go to my website, blueprintsounds.com, you can get access to my free worship training bundle called the Worship Booster Pack. It has PDFs and online classes in everything from songwriting, church sound, how to build a better band, the 5 elements of a full-sounding worship team. All of that is available for free if you go to my website, blueprintsounds.com, or click on the link nearby, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. All right, let's talk about the balance between ministry and family. So I was listening to Rita Springer's podcast with Cory Asbury, and he's a famous worship leader. He wrote Reckless Love, which was the song of the year in 2018. And he was talking about his time at IHOP Kansas City, now defunct because its founder, Mike Bickle, was found to have committed a lot of improprieties in the past. And this is not about that. It's about the model of how IHOP operated, and let me explain. So Cory was talking about leading worship there, 24-hour prayer and worship, and he had one section of that. So he would lead worship for 6 hours a day. And I want to quote him exactly so that I get this right. He was talking about how much fun it was and just being in the presence of God. But he said something that really struck me as having to do with family. Here's what he said. It was pure, and I loved the people that we were doing it with until we had Gabriel, our first kid. It became difficult because Anna, his wife, couldn't participate as much as she wanted to. And I was there every night for like 6 hours during that time. We should have been eating dinner together, putting Gabriel down together, reading him bedtime stories. It was like, this is clunky for life, clunky for family. And community started to suffer because of that. When you start having kids, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do what we were doing. As a dad of young kids, I can completely understand, and yet I am blown away that the IHOP model had Cory Asbury away from his family, leading worship for hours a night, for multiple nights a week, away from his kids when, just like he said, they should have been doing all the things that you do with young kids, reading them bedtime stories, putting them to bed, having dinner together. It's just insane to me. And this is what I wanted to talk about, the problem with the IHOP model. Because IHOP was all about sacrificial giving. It's prayer and fasting is about, that they were sort of the tip of the spear when it came to the prophetic community doing things that other people just couldn't do or they wouldn't do because they wouldn't lay their lives down as much. And yet it directly affected Cory's family, and it directly affected the community that they were in. Looking back on it now, you could have seen the writing on the wall and said, well, there's no way that that's sustainable. You can't do that, right? And yet, for years, IHOP Mike Bickle asked young kids, in their 20s and whatnot, to come and sacrificially spend that time of giving of their time and resources and saying no to other things like family so that they could come do 24-hour prayer and worship. Now, there's nothing wrong with 24-hour prayer and worship per se, but I want to go back to the biblical model of the Levites and look at what they did and why it was so clever. And of course, it's clever because it was God's idea. So we're going to read out of Numbers. Here we are in Numbers 4, and God is setting the laws and the regulations for how the Levites are supposed to operate. It's a very short verse. Numbers 4, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take a census of the Kohathite branch of the Levites by their clans and families. Count out all the men from 30 to 50 years of age who come to serve in the work of the tent of meeting." Okay, so here we have the numbers 30 to 50. If you're between 30 and 50, you're going to be serving in the tent of meeting, in the tabernacle. But in Numbers 8, there's a different set of numbers, and it actually makes sense, but let me read it first. Here we are in Numbers 8, starting in verse 23. The Lord said to Moses, "This applies to the Levites. Men 25 years old or more shall come to take part in the work of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50, they must retire from their regular service and work no longer. They may assist their brothers in performing their duties at the tent of meeting, but they themselves must not do the work. This, then, is how you are to assign the responsibilities of the Levites." So that sounds confusing at first. It says 30 years old to 50, but then in this other passage it says 25 to 30. Well, what we learned from the rabbinical tradition is that there was a 5-year window of discipleship or mentorship where a young man would come in at the age of 25, learn the ropes from men who were working between 30 and 50 years of age. And then when he was 30, he would begin the ministry, officially. And then he could work from the time that he was 30 to the time that he was 50. And then when he was 50, he was required to retire. But it says there in the scripture that he could still assist his brothers in performing the duties, but he could not himself take on that role. So we have 3 groups. We have 25 to 30-year-olds are learning the ropes. We have the 30-year-olds to the 50-year-olds who are doing the work. And then we have the 50-year-olds until death who are now retired, but they're able to be there to help their brothers out. Why that's so interesting is that means you have 3 generations of men working together, and that is inherently a stable community. So let's zoom out a little bit and not just look at the men, but let's look at the families around the men. If you were a Jewish man in this time, King David, King Solomon, time of Jesus even, you probably got married around your early teens, your 20s. So no birth control, you're probably going to have a kid pretty soon after you get married. If you are 20 when you have your first child and then you enter the service at 30, what that means is you've already completed some of the tasks that fatherhood requires. You've learned how to manage those early years, which are so intense. They're so stressful. You're low on sleep, all the rest of it. It's a huge amount of self-sacrifice, but you've gotten over that hurdle, and now you're ready to enter full-time ministry by the time that you're 30. And you've taken 5 years to learn it from other guys who are further down the road. Their children are older, and they are now in full-time ministry. And then finally, you have the wisdom of the 50-year-old retiree who still comes to the tabernacle. He doesn't do the heavy lifting because he's retired, but he does bring his wisdom, and he does engage the community in their own problems, right? Because every man who is ministering has his own family that he has to worry about as well. Well, the wisdom of those retirees coming and helping their brothers is vital. So that kind of structure means that the community can last, that those men can learn from one another. The young men bring vitality. The men who have experience know what they're doing, and then the men who have wisdom, even though they aren't doing the physical labor, have that wisdom to be able to speak into the younger men's lives. Isn't that brilliant? Well, now let's look back at our own model today. Obviously, IHOP, it's really easy to point fingers and say Mike Bickle shouldn't have done what he did, but it's also very easy to slough it off and say, oh, that doesn't apply to us because we don't have that kind of sin in our community. Maybe you don't think you do. But here's the problem. A lot of churches utilize the same model with variations of IHOP. And what I mean is, we have said that youth and talent is the only thing that matters. So we have increasingly young people taking the stage with big responsibilities to lead worship, and they are surrounded by people the same age, maybe 20s, 30s, and then after that you're discarded because you're just too old to be on stage because you're not vibrant and attractive and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the problem with that is that you've made your community unstable. You don't have the wisdom of people who are 50 plus. You don't have an apprenticeship, for 25-year-olds up to 30. So you're asking young people who are going to get married and start having kids to do this heavy lift, and all of a sudden when they start having kids and they're bleary-eyed because they're low on sleep, we expect them to still do the work of the ministry, And yet we haven't built it to last like God had the Israelites build their Levitical priesthood to last. And the reason why we do that is because we want the achievement. We want to lift something up. We want that worship to be amazing. We want that single or that album to be awesome. We want people to look at us and say, wow, that's really cool, so that more people come to the church so that we can build the church. Rather than making a community that can sustain itself. And that's exactly what the Levites were doing when they had their 3 generations working together. If you don't have 3 generations working together, you are missing something. You're either missing wisdom, new blood, or experience. And so it makes sense that the IHOP model couldn't continue. Yes, the sexual sin was one thing, right? And that got found out, and that was part of it. But that's easy to say that's someone else's problem when plenty of churches in America aren't built to last, and then they wonder why things blow up, and they don't understand that they built it according to the wrong model because we were after something we shouldn't have been after. Here's the point. Ministry and family done God's way should last for generations. It should be sustainable. It should not be boom, bust, boom, bust. It's meant for the long haul. And the reason why we're having the problems that we have with different ministries going under and different worship leaders, suffering burnout or alcoholism, or there's all sorts of gross stuff that we can talk about. The reason why God is cleaning house is because he's inviting us to rediscover the model that he intended in the beginning. And that is 3 generations serving together for the long haul. It is way past time for the American church to take a hard look at the way we structure ministry so that it can be done by men and women with families and so that it can sustain itself over 3 generations. Hey, I hope that video helps you. And again, if you need help with your worship ministry, click on the link nearby, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. Until next week, God bless and goodbye.